Hello and thanks for clicking on this video. My name is Debbie Simons, and I've written a book about the killing of Hae Min Lee back in January of 1999. I've made a previous video in which I lay out my reasons for writing this book and some of the main points about why I believe that Don Kleindienst III was almost certainly the real murderer of Hae Min Lee. My book involves a very detailed timeline and explanation, lots of footnotes and images, and then I include some bonus chapters. And I decided it might be a good idea to present one of those bonus chapters in video form just so you would get an idea of the kind of material that I'm exploring. So I've already done my previous video was about Jay Wiles, who doesn't appear in the book much at all because he doesn't really have anything to do with the case against Don. But I find him a fascinating character nonetheless. So I spent quite a bit of time laying out what I think happened with him and what his motivations were. So I decided that a good follow-up video about another fascinating character in this case would be Asia McClain, with a little appetizer from the young woman named Summer. And the title of this chapter in my book is Asia McClain and Summer, Two Truthful but Unreliable Witnesses. And I'm actually exploring in that chapter, and therefore in this video, how unreliable human memory is. So if you know anything about law enforcement, if you know anything about the legal profession, especially criminal lawyers or defense lawyers, you know that the gold standard of evidence when you're taking a case to trial is not eyewitness testimony, although most of us lay people would think that that would be the way it is. No, it's hard facts, scientific facts, forensic evidence, camera footage, that kind of thing. And then if eyewitness testimony backs that up, great. But when the two disagree, you know that that fallible human memory has come into play again. So I'm not going to actually read this chapter to you. I'm going to just kind of summarize it in some places and give you an idea of how my reasoning worked for saying that these two young women were totally sincere but totally wrong about what they thought happened on January 13th, 1999. So let's start with the young woman named Summer. We don't know what her last name is, and she never appeared in this case at all at the time of Hae's murder and at the time of Adnan's trial. As far as I know, she never even was questioned briefly by the police, the Baltimore County Police, when they showed up at Woodlawn High School on February 1st, 1999, in response to a tip that had been called in to Metro Crime Stoppers. No, Summer doesn't show up until the airing of Serial in the fall and early winter, October through December of 2014. She was a senior at the same time as Hae Min Lee and Adnan Syed. And so apparently, at some point during the time that Serial was being broadcast, one of her friends from high school called her and said, "Hey, you need to listen to this thing. It's all about that girl who was murdered when we were seniors in high school, and people we know are mentioned. It's really interesting. You should listen." So Summer did indeed listen, and she found out that the state's case against Adnan was based on the idea that Hae Min Lee had been killed by 2:36 p.m. on that Wednesday, January 13th. And she thought, that can't be true. I remember talking to Hay after school on a day when she did not show up for something. Now, that's the way, she doesn't spell it out this way, but that's the way she has to have remembered it. So she called into the Serial podcast hotline. They actually had I think they would give out a phone number, at least on the website, saying if you have any additional information about this case, give us a call. And she apparently was so determined and so reliable sounding, credible sounding, that they actually interviewed her on the air. And Sarah Koenig said, now, tell me what happened here. And Summer says, I was talking to Heyman Lee after school at 2:36 p.m. on that day. I know it was that day because she didn't show up for the wrestling match. Now notice that there was a certain chain of reasoning, that her memory was tying itself to an actual event. Yes, there was a wrestling match for which Hay was a student manager and Summer was kind of a trainee, and Hay didn't show up. Summer remembered being really upset that Hay had promised that she would be there and she wasn't. So she put those two things together, and her memory said that must have been the day of the murder. So that's the way it was presented on Serial. But people then started checking up on this story. I say in my book that perhaps the Serial fact checkers should have done this themselves, but they didn't. So when the Undisclosed podcast came out as a follow-up to Serial with the great Rabia Chaudhry and her two other great fellow podcasters, Susan Simpson and Colin Miller, they had some listeners, one in particular apparently, who decided, I'm going to check out this Summer story. And I think it was a she, went back and looked at the old newspaper box scores for high school sports on the relevant time. And she found out there was no wrestling match at Randallstown High School, that was the place Summer had mentioned, on January 13th. There was no meet at all that week. There was a meet the previous week on the Tuesday, January 5th. That has to be the day that Summer is talking about. And so in the book, I go into quite a bit of explanation here about why this January 5th date is almost certainly also the date that Hay wrote the famous Dawn note that was found in her car. Okay, so Summer was wrong. She was sincerely wrong. Sarah Koenig really pressed her. Now, are you sure? Oh, yes, she said. I am sure. But she was wrong. You can be sure and wrong at the same time. Now let's move on to Asia McClain, who of course looms much larger in this case. Asia McClain, as you probably know if you're familiar with this case at all, is again a young woman, a senior at Woodlawn in the same year as Hay and Adnan, who said that she could give Adnan an alibi for right after school on January 13th, 1999. She was so convinced of this that she wrote Adnan 2 letters after he was arrested. She wrote them to him in jail. He was in jail, not Asia. And she said, I'm willing to talk to your lawyer, have your lawyer call me. And Adnan's cack-handed, incompetent lawyer, Christina Gutierrez, yes, I know she was sick. Yes, I know she was overloaded. She knew that too. She had no business taking on this case. But she never even talked to Asia. And then she lied to Adnan and said that she had, and that Asia had her dates wrong. Well, Asia did have her dates wrong, but Christina Gutierrez didn't really know this. That was just an excuse she made to Adnan. So what happened? Asia said that she was in the library, Adnan came in, and they had a conversation that lasted from, say, 25 after 2 to around 2:45 on the day of Hayes' murder. And of course, just as with Summer, that was the exact time period that the prosecution said at trial was when Adnan had killed Hay. So if you think about it, the two girls at the time are giving kind of mirror images of ideas about this case. Summer, in a way, is giving Hay an alibi, so to speak. She is pinpointing where Hay was on the day of the murder, only that turned out not to be true. And then Asia is pinpointing where Adnan was right after school on the day of the murder. And so Asia never appeared at trial because, of course, she'd never even been contacted by Gutierrez. And Asia was always looked upon as kind of this purple unicorn. If we could only get her to testify, that would clear Adnan's name. And so she did finally testify in 2016 at the post-conviction relief hearings, in which she was questioned extensively by Thiru Vignaraja for the state and by Justin Brown for the defense. Neither one of these men, in my estimation, much as I respect Justin Brown, by the way, got to the heart of the matter, because there had always been two big questions about Asia's story. Number one was the actual conversation that she said she had with Adnan, the substance of that conversation. And number two, what she said about the weather and how that matched up with what actually happened on January 13th. So that's what I want to do here in this material, is look at these two problems with her story and then tell you what I think actually happened, what day Asia was actually talking about. Okay, so first of all, the conversation that Asia has with Adnan is problematic. She says she's sitting there in the library. She's waiting for her boyfriend, Derek, to pick her up. She's very mad because Derek is very, very late. She's bored. She's been there by herself for several hours. In walks Adnan at the close of the school day. Woodlawn dismissed regular classes at 2:15, and he would typically come over to the library to check his email. He would have from 2:15 until 3:30 when track practice started. And as I hope you know, but it's hard for us to imagine this, nobody has a smartphone back then. There is no such thing. No one has a laptop. If you want to check your email or do anything else on a computer, you have to use a desktop somewhere. You either have to go home, or most libraries would have public computers that were available for you to use. So that's what Adnan is doing. He's coming over to check his email. He looks over. He sees Asia sitting all by herself at the table. They know each other somewhat. Asia does not seem to have been in the magnet program, or she would not have had the light class schedule that she had. But she knows who he is, and he apparently knows her. So he smiles, she smiles, he comes over, and they have this conversation. Now, here's the problematic thing. Asia says that they have a conversation about Adnan's and Hayes' breakup. And in her testimony on the stand at the PCR hearing, Asia uses the word rumored. She says that she said to Adnan that it was rumored that he and Hay had broken up. But that's the wrong word to use for January 13th. At that point, Hay and Adnan have been broken up for 3 weeks. 3 weeks plus. It's actually more like 3.5 weeks. The final breakup had occurred, most people concur, the weekend of December 19th and 20th of the previous year. So it's been three plus weeks, and both Hay and Adnan have moved on big time. So Hay, of course, has started dating Dawn Kleindienst, and she has had nothing to talk about for weeks but Dawn. And then Adnan has had, at least by my count, 3 romantic relationships since he and Hay had broken up. So there's a Mary in there somewhere. Then there's also a girl named Anjali, and Sarah Koenig actually got her to talk on tape for a serial, and she says that Adnan was really cute and very romantic. And she has a nice little giggle, as I recall. And then, of course, Adnan has gone to a New Year's Eve party, and he has met Nisha, whom Sarah Koenig describes as being as cute as a chipmunk. And the two of them have been carrying on this rather extensive phone romance for a couple of weeks. So when Adnan supposedly says to Asia, yeah, she broke up, she wanted to date this white dude, I hope she'll be happy, that absolutely does not fit at all with what's actually going on in Adnan's life. He would be much more likely to say, yeah, and it's worked out for the best. She's got a new boyfriend and I have a new girlfriend and we're both really happy. No, that's not what he says. It sounds very raw and very recent. Well, you might say, hey, Debbie, you're just doing amateur psychologizing here. Who knows what Adnan might have said to Asia on January 13th? Let it go. Well, I don't think it makes any sense, but let's just let that go for the moment and look at what else is the problem with this conversation. And this has to do with something that is absolutely cut and dried, black and white, and that is what was going on with the weather that day. Now, all of us know, all of us who are familiar with this case at all, know that a huge ice storm moved into the Baltimore area early in the morning of January 14th. And that really bollocksed up the works in many ways about this case. But what Asia says about the weather does not fit with that very obvious weather event that happened that day. She says, first of all, she says, I remember that day because it was the day it snowed. But it did not snow on January 13th. It didn't even start sleeting or icing up on January 13th. The ice storm does not start until 4 a.m. on the 14th. We think that there was probably some light rain falling on the 13th. So that's the first red flag. By the time Asia was questioned at the PCR hearing, she had realized that snow was not quite the right thing to say, and so she had changed it to bad weather. She's not trying to be untruthful. She just thinks, I guess I don't have the weather quite right. But then she says, the weather was getting bad, and so I called my mom and asked if I could stay over at Derek's a little bit longer. So Derek had finally shown up at the library and picked her up and taken her over to his house. And I think she was probably supposed to be home at dinner time, but she called her mom and said, can I stay a little bit longer? The weather isn't looking so hot. But the weather was fine on January 13th. And if her mother was smart, as I'm sure she was, since all mothers are by very definition smart, she would have said, why would you need to stay late? It's raining. Get in the car and get home. There's a big storm coming, probably sometime tonight. You need to get home. So what Asia says about the weather and what the weather was actually doing on January 13th those two things do not match. I had always kind of had the vague impression that Asia had ended up staying overnight at Derek's house because of the timing of the ice storm. But that's not what happened at all. She just stayed a few hours later, and then Derek took her home. She makes this very clear on the witness stand. Okay, and then of course the next day, the ice storm hit. Now, where did Asia get this idea? Well, let's look at the date that she was probably actually talking about and see how that works. So, Asia says, here's how her memory was built. We know that memories can be built, can be implanted, can be stretched and twisted and distorted. So she remembered, as she heard that Adnan had been arrested, she remembered that she had talked to Adnan after school at the library on a day when there was a storm of some sort that caused people not to have to go to school for the next 2 days. So she puts together those little scraps, and then she decides, well, let me look at my agenda, my calendar. Now, this would have been the famous agenda that all of the Woodlawn students had, and we know from some other things that Asia was what might be called an organized pack rat. So Asia said on the PCR witness stand, the only time, by the way, that she ever gave public witness, that she had gone back and looked at a calendar that she had. This would have been the Woodlawn High School student agenda that every Woodlawn student had. And she looked at, she doesn't say this directly, but it has to be, she looked at January, because January is the relevant month. And she sees, oh yeah, there were 2 snow days, January 14th and 15th. That's when we had that big storm. And so I must have talked to Adnan on January 13th. And she says, I believe this is on the witness stand. Or it may be in the HBO documentary. She says, it just creeped up on me that that was the day that I had talked to Adnan in the library. In other words, that calendar entry is helping to build or create that memory. But in reality, that's not what happened at all if you look at what she actually says, with calling her mom, asking if she can stay a little bit longer at Derek's because the weather is bad and she's afraid to drive. Well, there is no bad weather when she would have called on January 13th. So I'm kind of belaboring that point because I want to really make it clear. She cannot be describing the events of January 13th. What is she describing? And let me make it clear again, she's not lying. Lying means, the word lying means that you are knowingly telling a falsehood. Well, so I was, kind of bopping around the internet one day. I don't even remember what my search terms were. We all know, those of us who do a lot of internet dumpster diving, that it all depends on the search terms. I do not remember what search terms I was using. But all of a sudden, this Reddit post popped up. And it said, "Am I crazy? Was Asia McClain wrong about her date?" You can look at the bonus chapter and get the actual link. And I thought, oh, wow, that's something I'm very interested in. So I read the post. And I do not know where this poster, again, I think it's female. I don't know why I think that way, just kind of the way it was phrased, but I'm going to call the poster she. She said, I think that Asia was talking about December 23rd, not January 13th. And I thought, what? That's 3 weeks earlier. Can Asia possibly have been that far off? So I did some looking. The only hourly weather report that I could find from that far back was for the airport, the BWI airport, which is quite a bit south of where Asia would have been and where Woodlawn High School was. But indeed, on December 23rd, there was a squall, a brief, sharp squall of snow right around 6 p.m. And I thought, that's interesting. And then I think the poster mentioned this in passing, and I went back and looked at it. I remembered. This is in Hay's diary. This is the date of the snowstorm where Hay has the fender bender, and Adnan comes to rescue her because she's run into the curb or something and she can't drive her car. And she has been on her way to LensCrafters. Adnan comes and picks her up, and that's how he meets Dawn, and the two young men kind of size each other up. And I thought, that's the storm that Asia is remembering. And if you have her little event with the snowstorm and being at Derek's house and calling her mother, if you have that on the 23rd, then suddenly things fit perfectly. She's over at Derek's house. It's starting to get towards her curfew, and we know that her mother had set a curfew. It's starting to get dark. It's December, so sunset's very early, around 4:30 or 5. And it's snowing very lightly. And then around 6, it starts snowing quite heavily. And so Asia looks out the window and she calls her mom and she says, I think I better wait a bit. I think the roads are going to be bad. Well, we know from Hay's description that the roads were bad. That's why she slid into the curb or whatever it is that she hit. So it all meshes together perfectly. Asia is remembering December 23rd. That's the day that Derek made her wait at the library. That's the day there was a snowstorm. And then, of course, what happened the next day? Well, the next day was December 24th. It was the start of Christmas vacation at Woodlawn. So, yes, they did indeed miss the next 2 days, plus the weekend and the whole next week and the next weekend. But because of the way our memories are made, all she remembers is there was a snowstorm and then we missed 2 days of school. And January 13th, there was an ice storm and then we missed 2 days of school. It must be the same day. But it's not. Does this mean Adnan is guilty? No, of course not. I got kind of tickled at the Reddit poster. She said, all these years I thought Adnan was innocent, and now I find out that he was guilty after all. And I just wanted to reach through the screen and shake her and say, no, this has nothing to do with Adnan's guilt or innocence. It just means that Asia cannot give him an alibi. That doesn't mean he's guilty. So anyway, that's my take on the Summer and Asia McClain stories. And I hope that you will get a copy of my book and you can read the details. You can look up the footnotes if you're so inclined. And I hope that you will have learned something about the human memory and its very clear failures and fallibilities.